Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Austrian Economic Center's webinar, Europe After Coronavirus, a Roadmap of Economic Recovery. My name is Adam Bartha, and I'm the director of Epicenter, a network of free market economic research think tanks from all across Europe. It's a pleasure to welcome you. The topic at hand is a difficult discussion, as public health officials and our amazing medical workers are still battling the virus. Politicians and economists are trying to think about a world that can function post-corona. And as you all know, planning our economic recovery is not just about magic numbers on random balance sheets. It's very much about the livelihood of European citizens, and a livelihood that not only determines economic prosperity, but also massively impacts human flourishing and the health of our citizens and the life expectancy of our citizens. So whilst we do need to focus on extinguishing the fire in our house at the moment, we also need to plan to rebuild our burned down areas and maybe even improve upon them instead of just rebuilding the exact same economic structures. And this is why the publication of the Austrian Economic Center and the Tax Foundation is so crucial. It clearly outlines the important role that the EU institutions and European countries should play in rebuilding the foundations for economic prosperity. And it highlights best practices from all across Europe when it comes to rebuilding these structures. So I'm very happy and delighted to welcome two of the authors of this publication and two other amazing speakers as well, who will present their initial thoughts on the best possible ways to European economic recovery. But just before they start, please bear with me for a couple of housekeeping notes. This is an interactive conversation where we would like to rely on your input and your thoughts and your questions as well. So if you're watching on Zoom, please make sure to use the chat function at the top right-hand corner to ask your questions. Please make sure to use your full name, affiliation, and country when making a comment or stating a question. And if you're watching on Facebook Live or on YouTube, the same rules apply. Please make sure to comment in the live video comment section by stating your name, affiliation, and country. You can keep the questions coming in rolling whilst the speakers are presenting their thoughts. And after the first half an hour, we will turn to Q&A. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome and introduce our first speaker. Daniel Bunn is the Vice President of Global Projects at the Tax Foundation, and he's also the co-author of the Roadmap of Economic Recovery After Corona. Daniel worked for 2 US senators at the Joint Economic Committee, developing legislative initiatives on tax, trade, regulatory, and budget policy. Daniel, it is great to have you here. The floor is yours for the next 5 minutes.
Thanks, Adam, and I'll try to stick to that 5 minutes. So one of the things that Adam mentioned is that this is clearly a public health crisis, but it's important to recognize that there are plenty of economic policies that are currently at work and will be needed for the recovery effort. So I'm going to talk briefly about some short-term policies that countries are looking at in response to the coronavirus, and then how they might be able to pivot to longer-term policies. So on the short-term front, a lot of countries are looking at targeted tax deferrals and delays. Most countries around the world have delayed tax payments and tax filing requirements for VAT, corporate income tax, personal income tax, and this provides immediate relief to taxpayers. Those tax payments that otherwise would have to go out the door can be delayed until a later point in time. And a lot of countries have delayed these taxes multiple times at this point. Also, there are some countries that are looking at targeted tax credits and reductions. Italy has provided banks with the opportunity to convert future loss deductions into current tax credits to ease liquidity restraints. And Norway has looked at its wealth tax and recognized that individuals who own shares in loss-making companies may not be able to have the liquidity to pay their wealth tax bill in this current time. So they've delayed some of those payments as well. There's also been direct fiscal relief, broad fiscal relief for workers, for businesses, and this includes wage subsidies that allows workers to maintain that relationship with their employer, even though they are currently on reduced work hours. And then also the broad loans and grants to businesses. Now, some of these programs are designed generally to fight recessions or to minimize the impact of economic downturns, but the size of this downturn, the size of this economic shutdown has put constraints on these programs. So the scale is much larger than some of these programs were meant to be. So some countries have struggled in rolling out these programs and making sure that the funds are actually getting out the door to the businesses or individuals who need them. But one would hope that we are nearing or potentially getting nearer to a turning point where we can start thinking about longer term economic policies and ways that we can pivot away from these short-term policies to productive policies for both sustainable growth and sustainable public finances. Public policymakers need to look at corporate income tax systems and personal income tax systems and look at barriers to work and investment and ways to reform tax codes so that on the other side of this, there's the barriers to those things can be moved out of the way so that we can pave the way for future growth. A lot of countries around Europe have had rough times in the last decade or so on the fiscal front. So it's important to also return to fiscal responsibility at some stage. Now, it's the sustainable growth and sustainable fiscal policies kind of go hand in hand. So you need to remove the barriers to growth while also looking at sustainable public finances. And on the sustainable public finance side, one of the things countries should be doing is looking at broadening consumption tax bases. Now, this isn't necessarily taking the VAT rate and hiking it up. No, it's looking at the structure of consumption taxes. A country can hit the same fiscal target, say a 50 billion euro target for VAT revenues in different ways. One country could choose to tax all consumption at a relatively low VAT rate and achieve that fiscal target. But many countries don't take that direction. Instead, they carve up their VAT base and provide lower reduced rates for different types of goods or remove certain types of consumption from the VAT base. Not only does this introduce complexity and distortions into consumer behavior, but it creates challenges for administering the VAT system and challenges of fighting fraud. So one of the things that countries should do is they should recognize opportunities to improve sustainable revenue, which consumption taxes are one of the least volatile revenue sources, by improving the structure of their VAT systems, potentially even being able to broaden the base so that the rate could come down while still meeting the fiscal targets. Countries should also recognize that short-sighted fiscal stimulus could be more expensive than the initial price tag, especially if that short-term stimulus provides maybe a short-term boost, but the long-term effects are not there. So countries should be thinking about the long-term policies, ways to improve growth and return to sustainable public finances over the long term. I'll turn it back to Adam at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think there is a lot to unpack there, but Kai will follow up on some of these thoughts as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Kai Weiss, who is the Research and Outreach Coordinator at the European Economic Center. He's also a contributor to numerous media outlets, including the Financial Times, The Observer, CityAM, and CapEx. And as mentioned, Kai is also one of the co-authors of this publication together with Daniel. So he will outline some of the other concrete policy proposals that European governments should take in order to mitigate the economic crisis post-corona. So Kai, over to you for the next 5 minutes.
Thanks, Adam. So I'll take a look at also the short and the long term, but when it comes to the EU, so what could the EU do to help us out of this crisis and then have a sustainable pro-growth policy? I think when it comes to the short term, the EU has certain limits because for whatever reason, national governments have decided that they want to have their own approaches, have their own lockdown measures, and also have their own economic programs to help their citizens. But I still think there are some really, really good ways that the EU could help and assist in tackling this crisis short term. one of the best is to ensure cross-border trades, that there are not insanely long traffic jams at the borders, but also not just within the common market, but also to the outside. You could, for instance, think of something like suspending tariffs, suspending duties when it comes to trade with the rest of the world. But I think it's extremely important that even if there are travel restrictions, and rightfully so for the moment, that at least trade itself continues to work well. Now, as Daniel has mentioned, what is really, really helpful, what could be very, very helpful, is direct and concrete economic relief, and certain national governments, as Daniel has explained, have followed such a path. Now, the EU has had some good ideas on how to help on that. I'm thinking about the SURE program, which is a shortcut for support to mitigate unemployment risks in an emergency, which is basically a program of about 100 billion euros, and which kind of wants to incentivize national governments to basically help those who are close to losing their jobs. It's kind of a Kurzarbeit German system, short-time work scheme to kind of promote these schemes. There's also a discussion of having greater flexibility within the EU budget, especially the cohesion funds, which I think could be very useful, because you're basically using funds that already existed and you're now using it for the coronavirus. Now, I've become a little more skeptical about that since yesterday, because there's a new report out saying that for whatever reason, the EU still has the same allocation of how they want to basically give the money to national governments. So at the moment, Hungary, which is not that hit by the coronavirus, relatively speaking, and has obviously been attacking democratic institutions in recent weeks, has received from this increased flexibility in the EU budget, has received double the amount of funding as Italy, which is crazy because Italy is obviously the one that is most hit by it. And I think having more flexibility within the EU budget is really, really important, but it should go to those places where help is most needed. Now, one more way, which European governments have already agreed to, is by using already existing ESM credit lines. That's, especially in contrast to Euro bonds and looser monetary policy, better method in the sense that there's some conditionality attached to the European Stability Mechanism if countries want money from there. And it's basically using a structure that is already in place. It doesn't create new long-term structures, which would be the case, especially with Euro bonds. Now, Euro bonds are obviously a very contentious topic. We can talk about it later if you want, but I'll just leave it at that it's so contentious that it's impossible that it will be a short-term policy, because it would take a long time to implement it and to actually have every member state agree to it. As for looser monetary policy, the ECB has basically worked out a pandemic emergency purchase program of about 750 billion euros. We are somewhat skeptical of that because that sounds more like economic stimulus, the one that Daniel has mentioned as being a bit short-sighted. We think that in the short term, it's needed that there's relief, not stimulus, and that the programs that you have in the short term don't cause more problems in the long term, which is certainly possible if you have an ultra loose monetary policy. When it comes to the long term, I think there are more opportunities. So first of all, fiscal health is extremely important. The Stability and Growth Pact has been suspended at the moment, but I think after an adjustment period, it needs to be reinforced, and really reinforced, not just kind of pseudo style. I think one of the most effective ways that the EU can help is through free trade. That's trade policy is something that the EU is in charge of. The European Commission just last week released a plan where it said that if you deepen the single market, if you reduce barriers even more, it could increase the EU's GDP by 12%. So that's a good way to basically, through free trade measures, to basically spur economic growth, especially if you couple it with free trade with other countries around the world. So if you speed up free trade agreements, that would also be very helpful. It should be avoided that there's more centralization, especially when it comes to tax policies. And I think Daniel and I agree that it's unwise of the EU to further promote tax policies that are not conducive with growth, such as digital taxes or financial transaction taxes. Finally, and I'll hope we can get into this a little more later on, there's been a lot of talk about a European Marshall Plan or a recovery fund or something like that. That's a highly questionable tactic, I think, because it's an economic stimulus. And I think the emphasis should be on freeing up the market if you want, and have pro-growth tax policy and stuff like that, not to have gigantic stimulus programs that will continue to haunt us for many, many years. So that's it from my side for the moment.
Thank you so much, Kai, for outlining both the short and long-term policies that the EU should be engaging with. And we have the pleasure to welcome Natalia Makira, who is speaking from the belly of the beast, Brussels itself, because Natalia is the general manager of eSight, a Brussels-based think tank focusing on trade policy. Natalia was previously a policy analyst who was focusing on research about the impact of trade on development, migration, and anti-dumping investigations, and also some issues related to intellectual property rights. Natalia, it's great to have you here. The floor is yours for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Daniel, Kay, for presenting the report. So I will not focus on fiscal and monetary policy because that's not necessarily what we are doing at eSight. However, before I get to the ideas and opinions we have about how deep in the single market can go and how free trade can be and what we need to do in order to get there, I just want to put it into discussion. It's an ongoing policy paper that my colleagues are working on. It's actually related to the Corona bonds. So they're not looking as such on economic perspective, but I think it's an interesting point of view as they are looking on the government effectiveness and how the government effectiveness in certain European countries decline after the crisis and hasn't rebounded since then. And not surprisingly, those are the countries who are now calling for mutualization of the debt and the Corona bonds. So this is more political perspective. The work is still ongoing, but they're trying to get to the conclusion. And so far they've looked into the data from the World Economic Forum and the World Bank. And it seems that a lot of this call for the government, for the European bonds, it's basically to kind of present their policy to the internal audience and the constituents because they don't necessarily trust themselves and they just basically trying to prove that they're doing something good. So this is just more a political perspective, what we're trying to develop. But going back onto the single market and the free trade, I think the political perspective is also very important because not many people right now question the role for free trade and single market in the European recovery. I just finished an online stream with Phil Hogan, who was answering questions in the European Parliament, and he stressed again that free trade and open markets would be a way to go in order to either ensure the supply of medical equipment in the long term, either to boost the economy internally, and they're just starting the proper review of the trade strategy for the next years. There's a lot of ongoing issue. There's a lot of questions that hasn't been answered yet. There are some of proposals that have not been revised, or we don't know if they're going to go through, whether it's a carbon border tax, the sustainability chapters, the Green New Deal, and how we're going to look into the trade agreements after the Corona crisis. However, the good point is there are some already discussion about trade liberalization in certain sectors and center products. And I think there would be an interest in making sure that we have a long-term agreement, plurilateral under the WTO. And that's what my colleagues are looking at too. They called it GAMES, which is General Agreement and Medical Supplies and devices that could be negotiated on the WTO terms, and basically that if another pandemic like this comes up, we will not be forced to go into the trade export restrictions and measurements and other authorization measures that we have right now in the European Union. Although it might not have been the right choice at the beginning, it seems that the Commission is now backing from the export authorization measures, which means that it's temporarily, it's not going to hold after 30 more days. I think right now it was an extension. More countries are getting this exemption, so not only the EFTA countries, but also the Western Balkans were exempt. So I think after the first initial shock that we've experienced on the global trade, but also on the internal market in the European Union, the Commission learned at least some lessons, and they're going to try to prevent similar situations next, in case of the second wave or another pandemic, if we have something like this to force again. However, I think on the single market, it might be a much more delicate problem in the long term. We are working right now on certain regulations that are proposed in the mobility package that actually applies to the cabotage. And with this initial panic and after the outbreak at the beginning of mid-March, when countries closed the borders, basically a lot of transport services were basically bring to a halt. The supply chains were almost broken. People started hoarding things. And basically what I personally think that we need more common sense. I don't think we need less regulation. I think we need smart regulation. We need better regulation, because as I can see right now, even if we have a lot of regulation in place, they didn't apply when the panic and fear took over. And I think we need to revise the European single market in this area. As I said, there's a lot of political discussion on the Eurobonds, on the mechanism of the fiscal and monetary policy, but I think single market is also a victim of a lot of political lack of compromise and basically trying to sort out structural member states problems on the European level, which blocks basically a functioning of a single market. So what we'll be looking further into how to make better regulation, and because a lot of people excuse us that we will be promoting deregulation, I don't think it's the way forward, because we need to have a certain set of rules, either in the internal market or in the external trade market, but those regulations should be better. They should lead a common sense, and then they should be at least better fit that can respond to the emergencies like this. We have another problem, the single market recently raised by many countries, among in Germany. It's about the seasonal workers as well, because the free movement was also stopped. So I think, as we can see, we kind of got entangled in these rules and laws that we're creating, but a lot of basically common sense is lacking. And I hope that when the Commission starts working on the long-term plan, especially for the upgrade into single market or deepening it, they've already announced that one law in, one law out. I think that needs to be much more deeper than just one in, one out. I think we really need to have a strategy and an idea where we want to go with the single market, what didn't work, which sectors, which industry, whether it's only goods or services, and take it from there. I think I stop here. I think those are the three things that are also quite interesting to discuss and hear other opinions.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for outlining the situation. Although the problems with the single market are deeply worrying, it's reassuring to hear that at least policymakers are realizing the important role of trade when it comes to rebuilding the new economic structures post-corona. So we're switching now from Brussels to London, where we have Tom Plackety from the Center of Policy Studies in the United Kingdom. And Tom is the head of tax at CPS, and he was previously the executive director of the Adam Smith Institute before he moved to the US, where he became managing editor of the Reason Foundation and then a senior editor at the Cato Institute. Tom, it's great to have you with us, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the UK and the broader situation in Europe. Tom, over to you.
Okay, great. Adam, thank you very much. Welcome everybody to my kitchen. Good to see such a big audience. Basically, I want to make just a little preliminary statement and then three fairly high-level points about the economic recovery from this crisis. So my preliminary statement, just a congratulations to Kai and Daniel and Martin for putting together what I think is a really good report. You know, I think the way that you approached the issue was spot on. I agree wholeheartedly with almost all of your suggestions. I'm struggling to think of any that I would nitpick, but there's bound to be something. So, you know, for people watching, if they haven't looked at the paper yet, do dig in and give it a read. So my first point, I think an awful lot depends when we're talking about economic recovery from this crisis on how and how quickly we get out of lockdown. And in saying that, I want to make clear, absolutely up front, I'm by no means a lockdown skeptic. I think that the lockdowns were necessary, are necessary, and it would be crazy to endanger the progress we've made by sort of too quickly just going back to normal. That being said, we do also need to consider the economics of this situation pretty seriously. So I think that certainly in Britain and the US, and I think perhaps in Europe as well, a big part of the rationale for the economic support measures that governments have come up with is to try and freeze the private sector economy in place, basically to maintain it as it was before the crisis so that it can spring back to life once we've got this virus under control. And that's a worthy goal. And I think in the very short term, that can work. But longer term, you have to realize that the economy isn't a machine with a straightforward on-off switch that you can push as and when you like. It's a complex living organism, and the longer it stays still, the more it decays, and the deeper and more lasting the economic damage this crisis has done is going to get. So I think that as the reproductive rate of this virus comes down, we can move away from the kind of one-size-fits-all approaches that most countries have had to take up until now, and try and work out a more strategic, more kind of tailored response. So we need to be flexible, I think, about opening up those bits of the economy that we can, while also sort of maintaining social distancing, while minimizing the risks involved. But the blanket lockdown, that there has to be an end date and a strategy for moving past that if we're going to get the economy back on track. That's my first point. My second point, I think after this crisis, policymakers need to think differently about growth. Now, something I've said before and been very aware of throughout my think tank career, that policymakers think of economic growth as something that happens to them. They forget, I think, a lot of the time, or they don't want to acknowledge that they really have a lot of policy levers at their disposal, and they can boost growth rates with the right mix of policies. Now, economic growth was incredibly important before this crisis happened. For a whole host of reasons, social, economic, and political, it's going to be even more vital now. And so we need policymakers to really focus on robust pro-growth policies. What does that look like? Now, tax. I could talk about tax sort of endlessly, and indeed in a report I'm working on with Daniel, which hopefully will be published this summer, I will talk about tax almost endlessly and the way that we could improve the tax system in the UK. But I think just to put it in really straightforward, like boiled down to the essential terms, most countries could make their tax systems more pro-growth if they tried to lighten the tax burden on investment and on earnings. And if they needed to make up the gaps in revenues, focus on, as Daniel said, the structure of their consumption taxes. Not higher rates necessarily, but broader bases, more neutral consumption tax systems that can generate reliable revenue and allow you to cut taxes elsewhere. Regulation is important as well. I think there are different regulatory measures in different countries that would have the biggest effects on growth. In the UK, for example, we have an absolutely insane system of land use planning. Probably the biggest single thing you could do to improve long-run economic growth prospects in the UK would be to deal with that. I suspect in many European countries, it may be labour market reforms that would be particularly helpful. But in general, I think one of the things this crisis has revealed is how quickly we can realise that certain regulations don't make sense or are counterproductive if our noses are pressed to the grindstone. And so I think it's time that we ask very seriously and in a big picture way, what kind of regulations do we really need to protect consumers and workers and promote competition? And let's try and get rid of anything that isn't meeting those objectives. A very quick side note on both tax and regulation. I think this crisis has shown again how vulnerable business models that are based on a lot of risky debt are. And I think that one of the things people are going to have to think about in due course is how do we get rid of the debt bias that exists in the tax and regulatory systems in most Western countries, I think particularly in the United States, but elsewhere as well after this. Very briefly, my final point, this is really just a teaser for further discussion if you want. But what have we learned from all this about dealing with future crises? In my career, I've gone through two of these things, or observed two of these things, the financial crisis in 2008, coronavirus crisis in 2020. And I think what seems clear to me, at least, is that a very big, very bold, early intervention can prevent an awful lot of long-run damage, and indeed can mean that the policy response, which might be extraordinary, can be short rather than dragging on for years and years afterwards, or months and months afterwards in this case. But that's obviously a very hard insight to put into practice, because if you immediately overreact to every potential crisis in the future, there's a good chance you're going to do more harm than good. So I think we need to think going forward about how we deal with crises, whether our states and our systems of government are sufficiently well set up to deal with those crises, and also think about how can we react faster and in a more sort of, in a bigger way, rather than doing the inevitable, dragging our feet and slowly ramping up the response as the situation becomes clearer, and you just end up in this sort of vicious cycle time after time after time. So those are my 3 points. I hope those are helpful and set us up for a fruitful further discussion.
Thank you so much, Tom. You're certainly demanding a lot of our political leaders. I sincerely do hope that they will manage to implement at least half of the proposals that you, Daniel, Kai, and Natalia outlined, because they would certainly contribute a lot to economic growth and to rebuilding our structures post-corona. We have had quite a few questions coming in already, but I would like to remind the audience to use the chat function at the top right-hand corner of Zoom, or comment on YouTube, and I will make sure to ask the questions from our panelists on your behalf. But as any moderator, I will misuse my powers to ask the first couple of questions, because I think Kai and Daniel outlined an interesting critique against the European Marshall Plan in their publication. So a lot of politicians have been proposing, indeed, a second Marshall Plan to mitigate the impact of the pandemic after it has passed. And it's certain that we cannot expect the United States to finance the economic recovery of Europe in this instance. But should the second version of the Marshall Plan actually exist? And if so, how should it be structured? Sorry, Kai, over to you.
Thanks, Adam. So basically, as far as I can tell, the EU is looking at 2 different ways of financing a European Marshall Plan. The proposed one by the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is to use the EU budget for that. And then there's the other idea of having a recovery fund outside of the budget. Now, the recovery fund, not a lot of that is known so far, other than that supposedly the size of it should be 1.5 trillion euros. And today, the Spanish government also said that they would like it to be, or they would prefer if those are not loans that governments can take from that fund, but that they are grants, meaning nobody would have to pay them back at one point or another. I think there's just not a lot of knowledge yet about how the recovery fund would look like, but especially the Spanish government's proposal makes me feel like that's just a way to kind of get money out of the air to finance all kinds of different policies. And I think that would just be, I mean, that's kind of, for me, it sounds like a prime example of a massive government stimulus. Using the EU budget is very similar. I also think it's highly unlikely that it will happen. When you look at the Marshall Plan of the US, what the US basically gave Western European countries was about 2.6% of the economic output of Europe. So if you want to equate that again, and you want to use the EU budget for that, that's just politically not feasible, I think. Because if you look at the discussion of the EU budget for 2021 to 2027, which has been so controversial, and there have been so many different opinions, the European Commission was talking about 1.11% of output, which is, I mean, much less than half of that, of what a Marshall Plan would look like. 1.11 was actually too much for many, many member states, so they actually reduced that idea to 1.07 before the coronavirus came about in February. Now, obviously, there's more enthusiasm now among member states to spend more money, but I think it's unrealistic to have something like a Marshall Plan again. But I also think that simply, again, as Daniel and I have mentioned, a stimulus is maybe not the right way to go, as it would drastically worsen the fiscal health of European governments and also of the EU itself. And I think instead, something like free trade policy and free tax policy, you can spur the economy much better than through that stimulus, which just seems gigantic and just, you know, throwing out money basically.
Sure.
Adam,
and
can I jump in here on the U.S. Financing comment that you made?
Sure,
so
go
I
ahead.
think I think one of the things that you obviously connected with the idea of the Marshall Plan is you know, the historic example of the U.S. stepping in to finance a lot of the recovery effort. And one of the things that's on the table, we mentioned it a little bit in the report, in European tax policy conversation, are these digital services taxes, which for, you know, on the large scale are targeted at the U.S. tax base or U.S. based companies. So the revenue scale from these digital taxes aren't anywhere close to that 1.5 trillion that Kai is mentioning, but there is still a little bit of the U.S. in these financing discussions as long as digital taxes remain in the conversation.
Sure, and that would be actually a fairly interesting geopolitical development if that would be stated out loud by some of the European politicians, that we would like to have US taxpayers finance our economic recovery. I don't think that they went so far as of yet. But linked to this question is also the European Stability Mechanism. And a lot of politicians have outlined that they would like to use those funds instead of establishing new funds or Corona bonds to finance some of the expenditure. Southern European countries seem to be rather hesitant about it, maybe because they regard the Corona pandemic as outside of their control, and the strings that would be attached to ESM seem to be too harsh for them. Do you think that would be a feasible compromise to use some of the funds available through ESM, or that should be out of the economic question and discussion as well? Daniel or Kai?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear other opinions on that, but I think that if you at least compare ESM, Euro bonds, and ECB as kind of last emergency measures, I would prefer the ESM. As I said, it's a structure that is already in place and where you already have funding available, and that all member states have already agreed to. So it's also readily available, in contrast to Euro bonds, where you still need to figure out how all member states would agree to it. I'm not saying that it's a perfect option, but I think the conditionality as such of using the ESM is also one of its strengths. I know that countries like Italy or Spain have been somewhat skeptical of that. They don't want a condition attached to the money that they need to do something. But what Daniel and I basically write in the study is that it's certainly possible now that the Stability and Growth Pact is suspended, is to say, okay, let's have no conditions attached to the money for the next 2 years or so until you have sustainable growth again. But then you obviously have to pay back the money at some point, and reforms need to be made so that basically the imminent debt crisis, in a sense, that Europe might await, that doesn't become the next crisis after the coronavirus crisis. Because that's obviously the danger, is if you basically just hand out money, if you basically just come up with financial resources out of nowhere and you just spend a ton of money, is that the debt situation that is already so dramatic in Europe will just worsen even more in the next few years.
Certainly, there is an increased risk for that to happen. That's why I assume that a lot of the Nordic and Western European countries have been rather hesitant about the introduction of these measures as well. I would like to switch to Natalia for a brief moment, because you seem rather optimistic about the future of trade as policymakers are realizing the important role of global supply chains after the pandemic. But governments across the globe have announced rather protectionist measures immediately when the crisis hit, and they seem to go even further and argue for the complete reduction of global supply chains to bring back manufacturing home, wherever home might be, And it's not just Trump's America First policy, but we have heard the same sentiments and statements from European leaders as well. Even before the pandemic, we had major issues when it came to global trade, and the WTO was already in a fairly weak position. And there was a lot of opposition against newly negotiated free trade agreements by the European Commission. So is the pandemic really the final nail in the coffin of globalization? Or how come you're so much more optimistic on the future on this front?
So we've been discussing the potential end of globalization after the pandemic. We don't really believe it. Logically, we might hear, we hear a lot of protectionism voices. A lot of countries imposed export restrictions. However, the positive thing is that the Commission understands the importance of free trade. They want to put it as a part of the long-term recovery. Also, I think on more national level, especially when the borders were closed in Europe, and for example, certain member states also impose export restriction within the European Union, I think a lot has been understood that we cannot really close down because it's not going to be self-sufficient. Europe is not going to be self-sufficient. If we want to maintain the standards of living as we have on a standard level in Europe, if we want to have all the products and services we are now currently enjoying, I don't think there is any way we can shut down the borders. I know there are voices, and at the Commission last week or 2 weeks ago, because they're now revising all the work program for different portfolios, but among them is also the Green New Deal. And for example, the circular economy, they would like to put it as a part of the green recovery. And for example, the idea was to include circular economy as a part of the global value chain strategy to see how much this can, for example, substitute the import. I would like to see the assessment on this. That might be an interesting actually exercise, whether we are able to at least diversify center supply chains. I think those are the voices. I don't think we will cut dramatically everything because we are so interconnected right now that it's not going to help or serve anyone long term. But I think it also needs to be understood in the more local level in the European Union and the capitals. I think there is a big problem there. We've seen a lot of lack of solidarity in the beginning. As I understood today, there are still certain export restrictions within member states. Belgium is one of the countries, for example, that doesn't export certain protective equipment outside within even to other member states. We have anecdotal experience between the companies that couldn't send the protective equipment from Germany to Italy because the borders were closed. I think that comes up. I think it's very important now that the basic sectors, businesses, SMEs, big companies still present how it actually affected them and how this kind of ideas of nationals and closing borders, reducing free movement of people impacted on the ground, because I think this is missing. I follow Belgian politics, I follow also Polish politics and Polish, and for example, a simple issue of closing borders between Germany and Poland forced people to either decided to stay jobless or they had to move to Germany where they work on a regular basis because Poland doesn't allow people to work cross-border at this point. They argue that why you can move between cities in Poland, why you cannot move between cities within 30, 40 kilometer radius between the borders. So I think that we need to collect this information. We need to share this because I think this is where the problem lies. And if we start showing this, I think there will be much more understanding how the world works now and why it's important to keep these flows. Either it's good services, but also people. And digital part is another one, but that's probably for another discussion.
I hope you're certainly right, and that policymakers will very soon realize the value of interconnectedness, both when it comes to the free movement of goods and the free movement of people. Within the single market, I think there are some tendencies to reduce these barriers that were immediately created after the crisis hit, but globally that will be certainly a more difficult task. And we have discussed quite a lot about the costs of some of these measures taken by European governments. And Tom, your colleagues at CPS published a report today outlining the government measures in the UK and how they're fighting the pandemic and the costs related to that. So in the United Kingdom, it looks like it's going to be around 150 billion pounds just this year, which would bring up the annual borrowing of the country to 300 billion pounds in 2020. And many Nordic countries introduced very similar and very generous measures to replace lost income of employees and help businesses. But Denmark has a government debt to GDP ratio of 34%, Norway has 38%, and Germany has 61%. The same number for the UK is 86%, for France and Spain 98%, and for Italy a whopping 135% government debt to GDP. So it seems obvious that one group is more able to afford some of these measures than the other group. So my question is, how long is this generosity going to last? When is the money going to run out? And do you expect some backlash at some point when the dust actually settles? I think you're still muted.
Yeah, there you go. I'm back. No, I mean, that's a really good question. And it's obviously a huge issue that we're facing. The research from the CPS that came out today, as you say, I mean, the UK was already going to run a budget deficit of 55 billion pounds, I think, if everything had gone well this year. Based on our Office for Budget Responsibilities scenario of 3 months of pretty much full lockdown, followed by a further 3 months of partial lockdown as measures are lifted in certain areas and not in others. We thought that the response to the crisis was going to add about another 250 billion to the deficit this year, which is obviously a big chunk on the national debt. Now, there's no immediate prospect, I don't think, in a country like the UK of running out of money. As much as anything, because the Bank of England can now and is now directly financing deficit spending by creating new money. And so obviously that's a kind of slightly extraordinary state of affairs to be in, moving beyond the massive support for gilt markets that was already occurring through QE. So in terms of actually running dry on funding, not an issue really. Looking to the future though, how does this change the debate in the UK and the path of our economic policies going forward? Look, I think that the most likely thing is that when we get through this immediate crisis, there will be some return to fiscal consolidation, some return to a more conservative fiscal policy, basically. But that it's going to be a lot of the big crisis measures, like the job retention scheme, where the government is covering basically 80% of furloughed workers' pay up to a certain cap. That stuff is all hopefully very short term. There are some measures they've taken, like increasing universal credit, which is our main out of work benefit, which I think are going to be much stickier and much harder for policymakers to wind back after this. But I'm not too worried about these huge spending items sort of staying in the budget going forward. And I think that those smaller items are, within boundaries that we can deal with. But the long and short of it is, I think that in the UK and probably in a lot of other countries, we're simply going to tolerate much higher levels of accumulated government debt. After all, before the financial crisis, we would have thought that the levels of debt that we had now were quite extraordinary and something that we couldn't live with. I think that there will be a similar change of mindset after this crisis, where everyone sort of collectively chooses to believe that the level of debt they've accumulated isn't really a big problem, right? And from a free market fiscal conservative perspective, I think it is a problem in the long run. But you can look at countries like Japan, which have for a long time borne much higher debt loads than we have, and have sort of managed to get through it. I also think there's a sense in which, sovereign debt markets, which determine your financing costs for the most part as a government, it's not just absolute levels of debt, it's relative levels of debt. And so countries that went in a relatively better situation, if everyone's debt is rising simultaneously, maybe it doesn't change the market dynamics all that much, and people can simply fund bigger debts over the long term.
Certainly, I hope that this is going to be the case and we are not necessarily going to see the major backlash either in form of inflation or some countries defaulting. We have a question from the audience, and they don't seem to be as optimistic necessarily as you. It relates to the European Central Bank and printed cheap money. So Tiit Elenorum from Estonia is asking that before the COVID-19, European Central Bank printed cheap money, but it mainly circulated inside the financial system. Now helicopter money can be soon received by entrepreneurs and consumers. Do you expect that this will result in one or 3 years' time in hyperinflation in the Eurozone? Or you're not necessarily worried about hyperinflation? Kai or Daniel, would you like to pop in on that?
Sure. So, I mean, I don't know about hyperinflation. I know a lot of people that have been predicting this ever since the financial crisis, and it hasn't happened so far either. But I definitely think it's worrisome how the European Central Bank has been printing cheap money for such a long time. And I mean, that's not what I said of the coronavirus response, that's not a new thing. That's been going on ever since the Euro crisis, even before that. That loose monetary policy. And I think sooner or later that will come to haunt us. And even if it doesn't, I think there's a huge problem. I remember that meme that's been going around from an American television station, I think last week or so. On the same day, you had, I think, the best day of the Dow Jones in like decades. But at the same time, the US government announced that there are 6 million more people that need unemployment insurance. And I think that's kind of what we would get by simply focusing on on loose monetary policy, is that certain groups in our population will profit from it a lot and the rest less so. And so I would be very careful in advocating for an even looser monetary policy than we already had.
I'll add to that and say that the transmission mechanism is what's critical here. So if things were not broken down in the economy and there was this massive expansion on the monetary policy side of things, that would feed through eventually to some sort of inflation. Whether or not it's hyperinflation is another question. But currently things are very much broken down in the real economy. Supply chains are disrupted. There's, as Kai mentioned, severe unemployment. It's currently washing around in the financial system. It's a real open question to what extent that will wash out into the real economy once things open back up. It's quite possible that, as Tom mentioned and you mentioned, Adam, with these high levels of government debt, that it will continue to be absorbed. This extra monetary stimulus will be absorbed by governments. Rather than moving out into inflationary policies in the real economy.
Sure, thank you both. Another important topic that was in the political discussion in the last 2 weeks was the very contentious issue of Corona bonds. Yesterday, Angela Merkel seemed to have come out for a different version of pooling of debt by using Article 122(2), where Corona bonds wouldn't be introduced, but existing EU treaties could be used for the pooling of debt of certain Eurozone countries. And we have a question from Vlad Oltanau from Belgium, who is asking specifically Kai on his opposition of Eurobonds. His argument is basically that Eurobonds would offer a 3% per annum, which would be less money and be less costly overall to citizens and taxpayers, even though it would mean that some countries like Germany or Netherlands may end up paying more. But that might be a question of solidarity. So would you mind explaining your strong opposition against the introduction of Eurobonds?
Yeah, so when it comes to what Angela Merkel today proposed, I'm not that well, I haven't really had the time to inform myself too much about it, but I think maybe there's something of a compromise there. It certainly seems like Angela Merkel's idea of having bonds, quote unquote, that's a temporary measure that doesn't create new structures that would stick around for a long time. Now, when it comes to Corona bonds, I think you need to differentiate. We need to differentiate between two different groups. One of them say they want to use it now as an emergency measure, and it will be a temporary bond scheme if you want. On that, I think it's just impossible to implement the system within a short period of time. I mean, I hope, maybe naively, but I hope that within the next 1 or 2 months, we can slowly shift into that long-term policy description phase. If you need short-term help, you need it now. And if at least 5 or 6 member states of the EU are completely opposed to the Corona bonds, then it's impossible to agree on it. And then it cannot be a short-term policy. Now, others of those that want Corona bonds or Euro bonds want it as a long-term policy. I think in that case, there's just this immense problem that the EU doesn't have a common fiscal policy. You have different tax and budget and and fiscal policies that basically make it very different on how people look at different member states. And the question that you just read said, okay, it's fine if Germany pays a little more. Now I'm biased, I'm German, but that is obviously a hard sell, especially for German politicians to their population, same for the Dutch, same for Nordic countries and similar. And I simply think that it will provide bad incentives, like as I noted, and as many others, Tom also noted, it's incredibly important to have fiscal health of some sort. And I think if you have Eurobonds, you are setting incentives to not have that, because every member state will issue the same bonds, regardless of whether they have 135% debt level or 30% or whatever. And that would eventually lead, I think, to incentives to not have fiscally healthy policies, but to basically just spend money. And for me, that would be, that could have catastrophic consequences.
Certainly. And another important point was that you raised about the distribution of cohesion money during the pandemic. So Daniel and Kai, you briefly outlined the fact that European countries are now proposing to spend available resources from the EU budget based on some of the previously agreed cohesion funds. And that would lead to results like Hungary receiving more of those funds compared to Italy. Another important point was how much these cohesion funds should be linked to the rule of law. So would you mind elaborating briefly, Daniel or Kai, whether you think that if we spend a lot of money in a very short period of time, which might make sense from an economic perspective, are you worried about the political impact and the unintended consequences that these economic measures might create, either bearing in mind some of the rule of law issues in Eastern Europe or just the inefficiencies of these funds being spent?
So I'll talk a little bit about the inefficiencies of the expense, especially elaborating on Kai's point about making sure that the money goes to those countries that are hardest hit. I think that's the most important metric here in allocating. Certainly you can have other requirements connected to the rule of law issues that you're mentioning, Adam. I think as you're quite aware, the situation in Hungary is not great, and the situation in Poland has been trending in the wrong direction in some ways for the last year or so, or last few years. But I think it's much more important to focus any allocation towards the impact of the Corona crisis. focusing on supporting those health systems in the countries most impacted, and providing the necessary protective equipment or medical equipment and other resources directly connected to the crisis. I think that's one of the things that's is really important here for these short-term responses, to make sure that they're tethered to the extent of the crisis and to responding to that challenge. And if you're relying on old formulas that are kind of completely disconnected, and the crisis wasn't even imagined as when those formulas were designed, then it's likely that the money is going to be inefficiently allocated.
That makes sense. Kai, last words on this matter?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Daniel said. I think long-term or even medium-term, when it comes to negotiating the next EU budget, there needs to be a very important discussion of whether you can link funding to rule of law issues. I'm not sure how likely it is that this will be successful, considering obviously you need unanimous agreement. I mean, in a sense, I think that discussion needs to take place. And so I would just say that at the moment, as Daniel said, it's extremely important to move the money there where it's most needed, which I would figure is more countries like Italy or Spain rather than Hungary or Germany or Austria or something like that. And so I think it should go to wherever it's most needed. And after that, we can talk about what the role of rule of law is when it comes to EU funding.
Certainly, the reallocation of resources is never an easy question, either domestically, but the pan-European nature makes it even more difficult. Gentlemen and Natalia, thank you so much for the discussion. I think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us when it comes to tax, regulatory, and trade policy. But the Europe After the Coronavirus, a Roadmap for Economic Recovery publication by Kai and Daniel and Martin are a very good starting point. So I would encourage all our listeners to give them a read. And the Austrian Economics Center is going to continue these discussions in the future. So thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for our panelists for your insights. And we hope to see you back in the near future again. Have a nice afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.